Daniel. It's almost like in verse 1, he sets himself apart just a little bit. This is the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Now, let's review just a little bit. In the first year of Cyrus' reign, he allows the Jews to return to Jerusalem, and the edict is made to be able to rebuild the temple. But it isn't until the second year of his reign that 50,000 Jews leave for the homeland, and they take all of the temple treasure with them, which is really interesting to me. I could see allowing the people to go home. What purpose are they serving in this vast kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, which is now just the Persian Empire? But allow them to take all the gold and the silver that was taken from the temple. This is the same stuff that Belshazzar was using in his crazy party the night that the handwriting happened on the wall. And Cyrus allows them to take all of this stuff back, and they are told that they can rebuild the temple, and then they will be allowed to use all of the temple treasure in the service of the temple like it was supposed to be. So it took them a little while to get everybody together and make the journey back to Jerusalem. They have arrived safely. The first thing they do, and I found this very interesting in history, they have been told that they can rebuild the temple, and you know it's going to take a little while to rebuild the temple. But before they even start rebuilding the temple, what they do is they rebuild the altar, and they actually start instituting the sacrificial system again and celebrating the holidays as they're supposed to, even though they don't have a temple in which to do all the rest of it. But when these folks arrive back, they have rebuilt the altar, and they have already started the morning and evening sacrifices again, and they have already started celebrating the feasts that they are supposed to celebrate. So all this stuff is now going on back in Jerusalem. In the third year, in this time period that this is happening, the foundation is eventually laid, but then the building work is delayed about 16 years or so by a lot of opposition. And one of the things that is incredibly interesting when you start looking at these dates and putting everything together, not only was Israel carried off and held captive for 70 years, but the temple was also destroyed for 70 years. There's a 70-year time period between when it was destroyed and when they start actually rebuilding it again. So it was pretty incredible to the extent in which God fulfills his promise to them in Ezekiel or to Jeremiah that he is writing about this captivity time. In this introduction, Daniel uses his Chaldean name to distinguish that he is the same Daniel. He hasn't been doing that. But we get here and it says, in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel. And if you're wondering, yes, he's an old man, probably around 85 years old. Some people think as old as 90. I think he's probably 84, 85 years old at this point. And it says, whose name was called Belteshazzar. He goes all the way back to when he first arrived in Babylon, and Belshazzar changes his name. And I can't help but recall in this first verse all of the things that he must be thinking as he just remembers this one simple thing. It doesn't matter what your circumstances or situations are. They try to change everything about these Jewish boys. And yet here is Daniel, an 85-year-old man, and still as faithful as he ever was. And it's amazing to me that as Jesus is going to come to visit him and give him this vision and tell him all this stuff that's going to happen in the future, can you imagine the memories that are flooding through his mind as he writes this? And he writes down, just to make sure you understand, this is the exact same Daniel that was carried away in chapter 1, now here in chapter 10. He says, the thing was true. The revelation was true. It came from God. You'll remember in other prophecies that are happening at the same time in Israel and are being sent to Babylon, that Daniel accepts them as God's word, and he does the same thing here. This isn't something that came from somebody else. This is a true thing. And he says, but the time appointed was long. He didn't know how long. He just knew that it was a long, long time. And a long time it really is. 300 years to the end of the reign of Antiochus. Talking about he's getting ready to look 300 years into the future, he thought 70 years was a long time, right? He thought the Babylonian captivity was a big deal. And then he throws in and he says, and he understood the thing and he had understanding of the vision. Now, that is very important because you'll remember that in some of his visions, it bothered him. And sometimes he lost sleep over it. And sometimes he was fearful of what was going on because he didn't completely understand everything, even after Gabriel comes to talk to him or Michael comes to talk to him, that he's still, wow. Especially the image of that fourth beast. He was shook to his core about the image of the fourth beast. But he takes the time here to say, I understood it and had understanding. That means it was well explained and it was thoroughly explained to me. Now look at verses 2 and 3, because we see him in a state of mourning here. It is a really serious time for him. And in those days, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. That's a long time, especially for this older gentleman. To be in such a serious state of affairs. You say, well, how serious is it? Notice the restraint. I ate no pleasant bread. And not only was it a pretty lengthy period of time, 21 days, almost a full month. He's, Daniel, we've seen this before, is pretty serious about this. He's serious to the extent that it has altered his diet. We had the wonderful opportunity to go to Australia, and they told us that if we would run Vacation Bible School, they would take care of snacks. And they kept saying, man, the kids are really going to be excited. We're going to have sweetbread. And they talked about sweetbread so much. What was it?
They called it fairy bread.
Fairy bread. And they talked about this stuff so much, my mouth was watering every time I heard them talk about this. I thought it was going to be the greatest thing in the world. Explain to them what fairy bread is.
They took plain loaf bread that was sliced from the grocery store, smeared butter on it, and put sprinkles like you put on a cookie. So bread, butter, and sprinkles. The children went nuts.
Oh, they thought it was
Not
that?
the ones we took. The other children.
We're spoiled in America. We have sweets. Trust me. There is not another country in the world, I don't think, that has sweets like we have sweets. But still, what he is saying here is he is drawing a contrast between pleasant bread. I cannot read this verse without thinking about Australia. No fairy bread. How did he live? No. But then balance comes to my mind, because remember who Daniel is. He is the second in command of Babylon. He has a lot of responsibility, and usually with a lot of responsibility also comes the privileges of that. And so I am sure that Daniel would have had the best food there was around. If they had any little dainty foods going on, any pastries, any special desserts, any sweet things, I am sure that he had access to it. And since he is the elder statesman around there, can you imagine how the cooks probably treated this guy? Daniel would be walking through. You can imagine they bent over backwards for him. Hey, Daniel, they probably tried to learn how to cook something from his homeland. But he's not having any part of it at this point. It says, no flesh. He went without meat for 21 days. I'd die. No wine, nothing more enjoyable than water, reminds me of the term throughout the Old Testament, bread and water of affliction. In other words, he was eating enough to live on, but anybody that knew Daniel and knew that there were certain things early in his life he refrained from because he couldn't eat it, it violated his commands. from God, and now you see that he is restraining from things not because God says he can't eat it. He's not eating it because he won't eat it. Not only does he change his diet, but you'll notice it says, neither did I anoint myself at all. He didn't put on any cologne. He didn't put on myrrh, aloes, or any of those things. And again, remember who he is and where he is. I mean, this is the greatest kingdom in all the world. They've got the finest perfumes and stuff available to him. He had the fanciest stuff. I mean, I'm sure that this guy every day walking in and out of work and where the guy smelled good. And for 21 days, he's not wearing these fancy things anymore. You have to know that the people who are around him are noticing that he has a dietary change and that he smells differently. What would create such a change in Daniel? Well, it doesn't really tell us why he is mourning and why he is doing this. But I have a few things I want you to just think about tonight. This is the first month of the year. And in the first month of the year, they celebrate, anybody know? Biggest thing for a Jew. Passover. Now think about it. 50,000 Jews have been allowed to return home. They are going to get to rebuild the temple. They have rebuilt the altar, and it's coming up to the time of Passover. And so possibly with the approach of Passover, it's the first time in 70 years they've been able to celebrate Passover. The 14th through the 21st day of the first month is when they would have celebrated. And so at the beginning of the month, with 2 weeks to go before Passover, it's quite possible that he's thinking about Passover and he is longing to be in Jerusalem. And he's too old to travel, and probably at this point still has responsibilities in Babylon that he has been entrusted to. And so he simply can't go. But here's a man who has spent his whole life 3 times a day opening his windows and praying towards Jerusalem and asking God to do something. And now God is doing it. Possibly the delay of the temple building and the opposition that's going on in Jerusalem has his heart burdened. And so for these 3 weeks, he is begging God that even though Cyrus has now given them permission and the folks have gone home, it's not really progressing well. And Daniel is concerned that the people are going to fall away and not follow through with the rebuilding. And so maybe his heart is heavy because of the temple building being held up. Or it's possible that only 50,000 people returned. There were a lot more than 50,000 people that were carried off, and they had kids. And so I'm sure it probably weighed heavy on Daniel's heart that here, this is an amazing thing that God's doing, and he has Cyrus make this decree that everybody can go home. But can you imagine how it must have hurt Daniel's heart, who's been praying all this time for this very thing to happen? And when it happens, the younger generation isn't really even excited about what God's doing? Can you imagine? It must have hurt his heart. He would gladly have joined that caravan. He gladly would have gone home to Jerusalem. He probably could not have waited to walk up to where the temple was and help with whatever he could do in the rebuilding of the temple. He would have loved to stand there and watch a morning or an evening sacrifice. And yet you have all these folks who are so comfortable in Babylon that they aren't willing to go home. Or possibly his heart is burdened for the sin of Israel, because we know from history that there's been this long roller coaster. We serve God and then we don't, and bad things happen, and then in the midst of the bad things, all of a sudden we start to serve God again, and so we have this big roller coaster, but the roller coaster doesn't seem to ever come as high as it did before it goes down again. And so maybe Daniel's heart is burdened because it doesn't seem like a whole lot of people wanted to go home. Doesn't seem like the temple's actually getting rebuilt very quickly. Doesn't seem like there ought to be the enthusiasm that there ought to be. Passover's coming. Passover is when they were delivered from the nation of Egypt. And now he begged and he begged. Remember the last time he was fasting? That God would do the same thing and deliver them from Babylon? And now it's happening. And maybe his heart is heavy because he's asking himself the question, will they stay true this time? Or how long is it going to be before we get comfortable in the world and we're no longer worshiping him as we ought to? Look at verse 4. Verse 4 through 9, we are introduced to this brilliant vision. And in the 24th day of the first month, so 3 days after he stops his fasting, as I was beside the great river, which is Hiddekel, then I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold. First off, I want you to see the setting. Setting is in verses 4, 7, 8, and 9. Daniel is walking by the river with his attendants nearby. And we know that there are some folks near him. Number one, he is an older gentleman, and there were probably some folks who were supposed to take care of him, make sure he doesn't fall, make sure he doesn't hurt himself. But number two, he is a man of great importance. And a man of great importance would have had servants nearby to serve lunch and to, do whatever he was doing. He may have been out here strolling along the river and just spending some time alone thinking about God, and the servants are standing there in case they're needed to run on an errand of business. I mean, when Daniel spoke, somebody better be hopping up and doing something. He's the second in command. But it's very interesting because in verse 7, he sees this vision, and look at what it says in verse 7. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision. You say, well, wait a second, if all these other guys are there, how come Daniel's the only one that saw them? Well, wait till we get to the end and I'll show you 3 different examples of when this happens. God only reveals himself to his people. It's happened before and it's going to happen again. For the men that were with me saw not the vision, but a great quaking fell upon them, so that they fled to hide themselves. The attendants were aware of something scary, and I don't know if there was an earthquake that happened, or if they were just so scared to death by the feeling of imminent doom or whatever. They didn't see anything, but they were scared to death, and they took off and hid. Now, you know that had to be a pretty scary thing, because they are there to attend to Daniel. Why in the world would you take off and hide yourself? And I mean, that'd be like the Secret Service taking off and hiding because they were scared and leaving the president standing there. Hello, your one job in the world is to do what? Protect that man. So here, isn't it amazing that something scary happens, and these folks are so overcome with fear that they don't seem to be too concerned about Daniel, and they take off and hide. Probably went down by the riverside and hid in the bulrushes. We notice in verse 8, Daniel is physically affected by this. He says, therefore I was left alone and saw this great vision, and there remained no strength in me. He is overwhelmed in his spirit. And then he uses a phrase that's pretty interesting. For my comeliness was turned in me into corruption. Comeliness is usually your face. You remember David is elected king, and they said he was a comely individual. He was good to look upon. What Daniel is saying here is, this dude turned pale. He was deathly looking. In other words, my countenance, my face, if you would look upon me and you would think, oh, that's Daniel, it looks like he's having a pretty good day. Well, if you had walked up to him and looked at him at this point, he would have been, pale as a sheet and deathly looking. It would have been obvious to you that Daniel had seen something that scared him quite a bit. He goes on and he says, and I retained no strength. He was powerless. Goes on in verse 9. Interesting that no strength left him, that his comeliness was turned to corruption, that he returned no strength. And yet in verse 9 he says, I heard the voice of his words, and when I heard the voice of his words, then was I in a deep sleep on my face, and my face toward the ground. He was able to hear and understand. Absolutely scared to death, but he could hear and he could understand. Now, one of my pet peeves is when people claimed to die, and they saw Jesus, and they were running and holding his hand, and they were doing all these other things. I am sorry, but every time I have noticed in the Bible that someone comes face to face with Jesus Christ, there's one reaction. You know what it is? Same reaction Daniel has. Face down on the ground. Because when you come into the presence of a holy God, we become very aware of how unholy we are. And there just is no comparison. So here we see him face down on the ground, and it says, in a deep sleep on my face. That's an interesting way of saying it. I was in a deep sleep on my face, in my face toward the ground. So what did he see that affected him in such a way? I mean, visibly changed. Probably can't hardly stand because he doesn't even have the strength to stand there anymore. Well, let's go back to verses 5 and 6 and actually look at the vision. Then I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man clothed in linen. Now, he doesn't give us a name. He is just going to describe for us here in verse 5 how the man was dressed. And then in verse 6, he's going to talk to us about the man himself. Again, I find it interesting that the very first thing that he noticed about him is how he was dressed. He looked, and behold, a certain man clothed in linen. Why clothed in linen? Because that's what the high priest did on Atoning Day. There was one time when he was going to go into the Holy of Holies, and they would offer a sacrifice, and they would collect the blood from that lamb. And it was the lamb that the whole nation of Israel's sins were put on that lamb. And then only the high priest and nobody else would one time a year slip behind the curtain that divided the holy place from the Holy of Holies. In the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. And on the Ark of the Covenant, you have two cherubim with their wings outstretched, and between them you have the mercy seat, where the very presence of God dwelled. And once a year they take some hyssop and they dip it in that bowl of blood from that lamb, and they go and they sprinkle it on the mercy seat, a sacrifice to atone for the nation of Israel's sin. When the priest got ready to do that, he dressed himself very specifically. And you're looking at a lot of it. He would wear fine linen like the high priest would wear. He would have his loins girded about with a golden girdle of the finest gold. There were other things that the high priest would wear, but notice that instantly, here is Daniel, who has not seen a priest in Jerusalem since he was a young teenager. And he immediately recognizes that this man is dressed like a priest. The next thing is, he looks at verse 6 and he sees these impressive features. His body also was like the beryl. His body is like beryl. What's beryl? Most folks would say that it's chrysolite or topaz. Now, topaz is an interesting mineral. In its perfect form, in its fully natural form, it is colorless, kind of like a prism. So if you looked at it, you could almost see every color displayed in it. If in any way, shape, or form, when it was formed, there was some kind of other substance that was formed in with it, then it would take on some color. The most popular color, honey yellow to a golden brown. Occasionally they would have some that would be sky blue or like an icy blue. There are some that are fiery orange. I personally believe this is probably the colorless looking one. Because often in the Bible, when they talk about the majesty of God, it says there is a rainbow over his head. Rainbow is usually the prism of color. There's more impressive features. His face was like the appearance. Now, if his body is like beryl, by the way, topaz is a very hard mineral. It's pretty rare and it's very valuable, especially in its colorless form. So you have this hard mineral for a body, and it's just really hard to describe it. And then you have this face with the appearance of lightning. Now, I don't know about you, but on a really dark night when lightning, all of a sudden, bam, and it's really close to you, what do? You have this bright, powerful, hurts the eyes, intimidating light. And I believe that's exactly what he is trying to describe here. Lightning always makes my skin crawl. It hurts my eyes. You know, and if you walk outside on a bright sunny day and you look up at the sun, you see spots, and you're blinking. If it's a dark night and you happen to be looking out over the mountain and all of a sudden lightning strikes, you do the same thing, right? Because it's such an intense, bright light. Very intimidating looking face. And then we get to his eyes, and it says, in his eyes as lamps of fire, the purifying quality of fire in his eyes. We're going to see that again in just a second here. He goes on and he talks about his arms and his feet, like in color to polished brass. You remember when we were talking about Daniel sees the statue and he starts off with gold, and as it goes down we get to the brass at the bottom, and we said that even that look like polished brass, when you polish brass, it's shiny and it's bright, your eye is attracted to it, and then you notice that it seems to be very strong and intimidating looking. I would be kind of scared to death too. But he's not done yet, because he tells us about the voice. And the voice of his words like the voice of a multitude. In other words, he says, when he talked, it was as if the sound of a multitude were talking. That is intense authority. Have you ever been somewhere, maybe, teachers, you've had this experience. You are in a classroom, and there's only 15 kids in there. And they start talking, and as they try to out-talk each other, it is amazing how much the volume rises in that room, right? And then you try to get their attention, you're like, hey, hey, hey! And 15 kids are like, there is an intenseness to the quality of many voices, especially when they are competing for each other, and the strength that they use in that voice. If you think about a multitude, and I think about them crying, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. You can't talk over a multitude. You can't argue against it, because the amount of volume and the intensity that's coming back to you overwhelms you. And here we have Daniel, who is overcome by the presence of this vision, who I believe without a shadow of a doubt is a vision of Jesus Christ. Now, I want you to turn to 3 different accounts, because I want to show you when Jesus shows up to someone, how it appears. Look at Ezekiel chapter 1. Ezekiel chapter 1. Starting in verse 26. And above the firmament that was over their heads was the likeness of a throne, as the appearance of a sapphire stone. And upon the likeness of the throne was the likeness as the appearance of a man above upon it. And I saw as the color of amber, interesting, amber's not that far off from beryl or topaz, as the appearance of fire round about within it, from the appearance of his loins even upward, and from the appearance of his loins even downward. And I saw as it were the appearance of fire, and it had brightness round about it, as the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud in the day of rain. What's that? The rainbow. And again, I think he uses the rainbow because I think the rainbow, even though the LGBTQTRP crowd, and however other things we have coming here in the next few years, have hijacked the rainbow, he put the bow in the sky as a promise that he would never again flood the world. But when we see the rainbow, I don't think it's just symbolic of that promise as much as it's symbolic of who made the promise. And I believe what he does when he spreads the rainbow out and he shows us all those different colors is he is revealing to us the colors of the character of his Shekinah glory. And so here you have this person that, notice, Ezekiel is struggling to describe. And he says, above this throne was a bow, like you would see on a rainy day when the light is diffused and you have all this color that comes out of it. He goes on in the middle of 28 and he says, this was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Interesting, right? Ezekiel removes all doubt as to who you're looking at. He just tells us. And when I saw it, I ran up and held his hand and we talked and I said, Dad! Now what did he do? I fell upon my face and I heard a voice of one that spake. Now go over to chapter 2. Such was the effect upon Ezekiel. Look what he says. And he said unto me, Son of man, stand upon thy feet, and I will speak unto thee. And the Spirit entered into me when he spake unto me, and set me upon my feet. Does that sound like he had no strength, and his strength had returned from him? That I heard him that spake unto me. Very similar situation to what we have with Daniel. Now, let's go to the book of Acts. You say Jesus Christ showed up in the book of Acts? Yes, he did. We're going to go to chapter 26 first. Because Paul is before Agrippa, and he is talking to him, and he is telling him his testimony. So starting in verse 12, he says, Whereupon, as I went to Damascus with authority and commission from the chief priests, at midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven, above the brightness of the sun, shining round about me and them which journeyed with me. And when we were all fallen to the earth, I heard a voice. Notice what happened to him? Did he reach up and grab his hand and chat with him? They were fallen to the earth. And then he heard the voice speaking unto him. Now go back to chapter 9 of the book of Acts. Because in chapter 9 is the original occurrence of what he is telling Agrippa. Starting in verse 3. And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. And he fell to the earth, and he heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, now there's no doubt who he's talking to again, right? He's not talking to an angel. I mean, he uses the word Lord. He knew exactly who he was dealing with. I am Jesus, whom thou persecuted. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And the Lord said unto him, Arise and go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do. Now pay attention to verse 7. And the men which journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but what? So isn't it interesting that he comes and all of a sudden Paul is in this group of riders. We have no idea how many is in the company, and they're heading down to Damascus, and this incredibly powerful, overwhelming light shines down. They fall to the ground. He knows who he's talking to. He sees them. Everybody else just hears a voice. Kind of sounds like Daniel, doesn't it? Go to Revelation chapter 1. John is on the Isle of Patmos. He is an old man. And in Revelation chapter 1, verse 13 through 16, you're going to hear some somewhat similar descriptions. And in the midst of the 7 candlesticks, one like unto the Son of Man, that is the famous term that Jesus used for himself while he was on the earth, his favorite term. Clothed with a garment down to the foot, and girt about the paps with a golden girdle. His head and his hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as what? Every time we see Jesus Christ, we see eyes like the flame of fire. And we're going to stand before those eyes someday, and he is going to discern to the thoughts and intents of the heart why we did what we did with those flaming, fiery eyes. And his feet were like unto fine brass, as if they had been burned in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of... Now, if you want to test the theory, you can travel to New York, and they will allow you to go down on what they call the hurricane deck underneath where? Niagara Falls. We were there not that long ago as a family, and I have to admit I was a shad disappointed. Because when I was a kid and they built the hurricane deck, they built it so that you could actually stand on part of that deck and the water would come off of there and hit you. And we were there, some little kid was walking along, and one of the instructions that used to be, I don't even remember if it was there this time, but it used to be on the walls, if you have children less than such and such, hold them by the hand and keep them because it could be dangerous out there on the hurricane deck. And this little kid was being a jerk. Mom and Dad are trying to get pictures, and he went running off and ran under some of that water, and that water hit him on the head. Bam! Wiped that little jerk right out. I'm sorry, that little cherubim. Do you know for the entire rest of the time that kid did not leave his mom and dad's side? Never heard a complaint out of him, no crying, no nothing. They walked over, stood him up, and he was like, what the world just hit me? Can we go now? No, we're going to sit here. Okay. That little guy thought he was in control of everything until he came into contact with an overwhelming force that swept him from his feet. And when everybody had kind of moved off to the side and my mom and dad were over taking some pictures, I walked over to a corner of the hurricane deck where the water would come right down next to my face. And I turned around with my back to the falls, and some of the water was actually hitting me on the shoulders and the head. And I yelled to my mom and dad. And would you imagine they ignored me? So I turned around and I faced that water, and I got my nose right up next to it, which you got to be careful because when it comes down, I mean, it's like sandblast in your face. And I started yelling at the water. And do you know that I could not even hear myself speak? It wasn't long after that Pastor Bill at High Point was going through the book of Revelation, and we read that verse. And I thought to myself, if Jesus Christ is in any part as powerful as what I saw come off of Niagara Falls, you are standing in the presence of awesomeness, intensity. Now I got to tell you, Jesus Christ is 1 billion times more impressive than anything close to Niagara Falls. But you can imagine, can't you, that here's Daniel, and he sees this man. Is it any wonder the color drained from his face, and he's flat on his face, as if it were in a deep sleep, and he felt like he had no strength in his body? He has come face to face with Jesus Christ. We're going to move into our communion service. As we do, I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 11.